Thanks everybody for joining today. You are joining a side event that's focused on really digging into what the private sector can do to support governments around the world who are struggling with energy access to really accelerate achievement of 2030 goals and bringing SDG 7 to life. So this side event has been organized as part of the ministerial thematic forum week. And the focus of the high-level energy dialogue has really been, I think, to draw a global attention both to the level of ambition and the kind of partners that are necessary, as well as the investment and tools that are needed to accelerate the end of energy poverty. So this week falls after about, I think it's been 3 or 4 months that a number of us on this panel have been part of the technical working group series. And that focus has really been to get together experts from public and private and civil society organizations to talk through what needs to be done to ensure that SDG 7 does indeed come to fruition by 2030. We have attached to the invitations and throughout social media the report that was released this week, focused specifically on the technical working group on energy access. Out of that report came a series of recommendations, and we will zero in on one of those recommendations for further discussion today from the experts we've assembled. So just briefly, let me identify who is going to be part of this discussion. First of all, we have Koen Peters, who is the Executive Director of the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, known as GOGLA. We also have Aaron Chang, who actually comes to us from PowerGen, but is part of the Board of Directors of the African Minigrid Developers Association, another key set of technologies and partners that can help achieve universal access. In addition, we've got James Wakaba joining us from CLASP, which is an organization that's really well focused on standards, productive use, appliances. And then, of course, Simon Desjardins from Shortlist, an excellent talent and recruiting firm that's really been focused on ensuring that we have the workforce of the future to power up all these companies to achieve the end of energy poverty by 2030. So briefly, the high-level dialogue focused on a series of recommendations, including some recommendations that are focused on energy transition pathways and focused on really bringing clean cooking into the equation in a way that maybe it hasn't been so much before. That includes a prioritization of political commitments and financing to accelerate clean cooking. And finally, a real focus on energy access and the value that it has, not just in the connections themselves, but in being a key enabler and driver of inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economic recoveries. All encompassed, this is a really big focus on this report, on the focus of putting people at the center of the opportunities to deliver energy access and the importance of last mile delivery. But what we're going to be honing in on today is recommendation 6 in this report. And just to restate in brief what that focuses on is really the role of the private sector and enterprises to deliver innovative, cost-effective, and scalable energy access business models so that these solutions can be accelerated across households, communities, and businesses. So I would hope that today we get into a fairly broad discussion, not just about business models, but what it is that this sector needs to succeed. Invited to join us today have been all of the permanent offices of the UN with countries that have 50% or less energy access. And this is really a stellar group of people to bring to these countries to hear firsthand what it requires to have these companies succeed. And hopefully we'll hear some great stories of success, as well as some very open discussion about what the challenges have been to achieve scale to this point, and hopefully focus on removing those barriers so we can together see a real change in how we proceed as a sector and as a global community. So with that, could I first turn the mic over to Koen Peters from GOGLA to maybe just share some of your opening thoughts, maybe in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll move on down the line and get into further Q&A and discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Christina, for that great scene setter. Hi everyone, I'm Koen. Koen Peters, I'm from GOGLA. We are an industry association with around 200 members promoting standalone off-grid solar power solutions, from solar lanterns to solar home systems, towards standalone productive use appliances such as solar water pumps and solar refrigeration. And this is a sector that over the last decade or so has reached about 420 million people with its solutions. And I think as such has really proven that the technologies are there, the products are there, the business models are there, the demand is there, and also that the impact is there. But still, if we want to address SDG 7 as industry, we will not be able to do it all alone. We very much like this, the high-level dialogue process, and recognize it's an important year. We actually had yesterday our own annual member conference in which we discussed the high-level dialogue and posed the question to our members: do you think that this is a unique opportunity, or are you a little bit more skeptical, or do you actually think it's a major distraction? And I was surprised and pleased to see that quite a number of our members are really seeing this as a special opportunity to raise the profile of the industry. Although there's also a number of our members that are a little bit more skeptical about what this is going to result for individual companies. Still, there was broad support among our membership that GOGLA should use this the high-level dialogue to come with our own compact and commitment towards delivering universal energy access. And actually, we're working on a fairly bold compact that we would like to encourage all sector stakeholders, not just industry, but also governments, donors, investors, research partners, NGOs, etc., to endorse, and saying that the off-grid solar industry should be able to really reach 1 billion people by 2030. But we also say this is not so much a promise from the private sector and the industry. This is actually just as much an ask, because the only way we will be able to achieve that 1 billion is if governments and donors and investors and the industry are all working into that same direction. And then I think that number that sounds so bold and out of reach today should really be reachable with the products and models that we've already tried and tested. And that, I think, is actually the main theme for me in this high-level dialogue. Public sector can do so much, donors can do so much in mobilizing more support. The industry can do so much, but it's really when they start to leverage off each other and support each other that we really get new partnerships that are really reaching new scale. So for me, that's the important story of the high-level dialogue. And what I think is useful of today is that we zoom in a little bit of, nice to say that, but how difficult or easy is that going to be? Because, well, we can talk about it, but in practice it's going to be very hard to achieve that. My feeling is that if we want to establish those new partnerships between governments and donors and industry, we really need to zoom in on the national level. This is not something I think that can be done. We can definitely raise the profile for the industry and for the technologies and the impact at the global level and create more awareness and create more inspiration. But it's really at the national level that we need to really work on the details of those partnerships, and that's where I think intermediaries such as industry associations, national industry associations, but also GOGLA and AMDA through their regional teams can come in and provide some oil to the cogs as they try to turn to each other and really help to let people communicate with each other. Or maybe I'll pause there. I'll stop there because I think that's been more than 2 minutes. But I think this is the conversation that we should be having. How do we bring all those parties together, and how do we make sure that they talk to each other and talk the same language?
Yeah, Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Koen. Those are some great opening remarks. And I'm sure we're going to look forward to digging into the details of the compact a little bit later today. So next, it'd be great to hear from Aaron Chang, who again comes to us from PowerGen. So he's got very specific, detailed knowledge of what it takes to make mini-grids work at a country level, but also as a member of the board of the African Minigrid Developers Association. So he'll have a really good eye on more broadly what the group of companies that are really leading the way here are focused on when it comes to national implementation. So Aaron, if you could give us your opening remarks.
Sure, thanks Christina. And Koen's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. So I'm from PowerGen. We're a distributed energy company across 5 countries in Africa. Also a board director of AMDA, which is the Industry Association for Minigrid Developers. AMDA has been set up for about, I believe, the last 3 to 4 years with the purpose to create an enabling environment in the sector, working with donors, governments, investors, and also developers. I think I'd echo a lot of the same thoughts that Koen has advocated for, which is that the private-public partnership is extremely important. Donors and governments are ultimately the key to creating an enabling environment for investment and for developers to build projects, use new technologies, and bring progress toward SDG 7. So we really cannot, as a developer, we cannot do any of this without the support of governments or without the support of donors. We're looking to create win-wins in terms of policy and programs that allow for all 4 of those stakeholders and especially the end users to benefit in a win-win or a win-win across those 5. I won't say win-win 5 times, but that's the gist of it. We do think about it following some basic principles, and I like to think about it using, I guess, the 3 S's, but speed, scale, and sustainability. I think those are 3 really good principles to anchor around. On speed, I think it's relatively well known that at the current pace of electrification, there will be more people unelectrified by 2030 than there are today. Despite the ambitious SDG 7 goals, we're still not on pace currently. So speed is obviously of the paramount importance. Number 2 is scale. I think everyone knows that there's more than 600 million people without access to electricity. And in addition to that, I'd also point out that currently being in Lagos and living in a few African countries over the last 6 years, the 500 million people that do have electricity on this continent are often experiencing poor power reliability. So being able to do this at scale and rolling out solutions that can benefit millions and eventually 1+ billion people is really important. And then number 3 is sustainability, to ensure projects are commercially viable and still operating in 20 to 30 years. So those are some of the principles that we think about before we get into detailed program and policy recommendations. But as we work closely with donors and governments, we try to keep, I think, the complexity of keeping so many stakeholders happy across the board grounded to those 3 principles. I'm happy to talk more about those. But Christina, I'll pass it back to you, and yeah, look forward to the conversation.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. I really like the 3 S's. There'll be lots of fodder for conversation there. James, over to you now from CLASP. If you could tell us a little bit about CLASP for the unindoctrinated, the few that remain in the world, and a little bit about your own perspectives, I think particularly focused on the role of productive use, appliances, and probably quality standards as it relates to achieving the goals identified in the high-level dialogue work to date.
Mm. Thank you very much, and nice to be in this forum. As said, my name is James Wakaba. I am the Africa Director for CLASP based out of Nairobi. CLASP is an appliance-focused international NGO. We focus on appliance and equipment, energy performance, and quality. And we believe that this is a good pathway to mitigate and adapt to climate change, as well as important to this forum to expand electricity access and other forms of clean energy access. Efficient, high quality appliances that CLASP supports are key, we believe, to SDG number 7 in terms of affordable and sustainable energy for all, and renewable energy services, other services like cooling, communications, mechanization. They empower low-income communities and improve lives in a climate-friendly manner. So we welcome any compacts, any commitments that include energy efficient and high quality appliances, and are happy to support this initiative. In terms of our own experience, we have worked a lot in, as you asked about productive use, we have worked a lot in cold storage or refrigeration, as Kun mentioned. We have seen the impact that this can have for the last mile communities. We still have a concern that a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the discussions still focus a lot on the big energy supply technologies, the building of huge supply infrastructure. And a lot of the times appliances are not central to that dialogue. And we believe that that should change, and appliances need to come to the center stage, good, efficient, quality appliances. We are also looking at an upcoming revolution in electric cooking. And I know there is a lot of focus on clean cooking. We are looking at electric cooking through super efficient electric cook stoves, electric pressure cookers, that we believe now are a viable replacement for most types of traditional biomass cook stoves, especially in off-grid or clean grid contexts where they cook better, they cost less, and they contribute to a clean environment. So we want to make the case for increasing access to such kind of cooking equipment, and we have a couple of thoughts about how we think this can be financed and how the private sector and the utilities can come together to finance this, and we'll be talking about that in the course of this presentation. So yeah, we welcome this discussion. I look forward to the debate, and many thanks for the invite. I'm sure we'll have a great time. Thanks. Back to you.
That's great. Thank you, James, so much. And of course, one of the important things when we're talking about appliances and productive use of energy is making sure that people are maximizing the benefits of their connections, but also it's part of sustainable business models. Having a meaningful load, for example, for a Minigrid is essential for sustainability. So again, we'll get into some more of that discussion later today. And Simon, if I could toss it over to you to introduce Shortlist and talk a little bit about your point of view about what's needed to really ensure that this sector that's growing so rapidly, known as decentralized renewables, has the people power we need to do our part to achieve SDG 7.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christina, and great to be here. I'm one of the co-founders of Shortlist. We're a talent and recruitment company operating across sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and work with a range of different kinds of organizations, from governments to large energy companies to startup energy companies, and to a variety of organizations in adjacent sectors. And since we built the company and started the company about 6 years ago, I've worked with close to 1,000 different employers across our regions, and placed thousands of young people into jobs, as well as senior talent. And a lot of the work that we do is in energy, and that's a lot of our backgrounds come from there. And so I guess that my main headline today is that the energy challenge is also a talent challenge, and we can't separate those two. And solving SDG 7 will require, beyond all the policy work and the finance work and the technology work that needs done, also require a lot of people to get it done. And that's how we're helping to move the sector forward. And I think if I'm just thinking about the macro trends that are happening in this space, we're seeing a few things. I mean, one is that the sector, and from a government perspective, this decentralized renewable energy sector has become large enough that it's become a real big employer. And our friends at Power for All and Christina and her team have done an amazing job of highlighting just how many jobs, in fact, there are coming up in this space. And depending on what timeline you're looking at, it's either tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs, and even more than that at both the formal and informal sectors. So it's a huge space. And when we look at when we work with employers today versus 5 years ago, today we're working with companies and placing hundreds of young people into jobs per company, as compared to 5 years ago, it was typically a few dozen per company. So it's ramping up, and I think it's incredibly exciting from an employment, particularly youth employment lens. The other thing that we're seeing along those lines is just the variety of different kinds of jobs that are required, from large numbers of customer service agents who are typically urban-based, who can typically be roles that can typically be done by entry level or recent graduates, as well as rural salespeople that are out there distributing cook stoves and solar home systems and other energy products, as well as much higher skilled jobs such as engineering and data and others. So just a large variety of terrific roles at both the formal and informal sector. The other thing we're excited about as a company, and I think for the sector, is just how hiring practices are beginning to shape the gender and gender inclusivity and diversity topics, in the sense that energy, I think, as all of you will know, has been historically quite male dominated, and we're helping to change that. And I think hiring practices and the way that recruitment is done can actually help inform and can help move the needle towards a sector that is much more gender balanced. So for example, when we place candidates at scale into the energy sector, we have a minimum of 50% female placement targets that we put on ourselves. And we've been achieving those targets through very deliberate work using technology that helps take out the bias in the recruitment process, as well as language and content and marketing that we're using very deliberately to attract a greater number of female applicants into the candidate pool. Folks that might not have thought of the energy sector as a possible career path are now considering it. So I think there's a huge number of things that we can do from a recruitment perspective to help just make the energy sector a lot more gender diverse. And lastly, I think the other thing we're excited about is, from an education and skills perspective, how we can help move the needle on actually creating real long-term employment in this sector. So in addition to all the work that's being done on formal education and diplomas, we're also working with governments across Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia to create experiential learning opportunities for young people who might not have a formal university degree, but are really in need of practical on-the-job experience. And so placing thousands of young people into experiential learning internships, where essentially they're getting 12 months of on-the-job experience, learning how to be a salesperson for an energy company, or learning how to be a customer service rep, or learning how to be any other of these high volume jobs. And at the end of that, we're seeing enormous conversion rates, above 90%, in fact, from those experiential learning internships into full-time jobs. So we know that there are really exciting pathways that can supplement and be additional to the formal education sector, and the hiring and talent world playing a key role in facilitating that. So we're excited about a whole host of different aspects of this space, and happy to talk more about this. But great to be here. Christina, back to you.
Thank you so much. And just for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with Power for All, let me just take a few moments and introduce our organization. So Power for All is a global campaign that's really focused on raising that ambition and pushing for faster access to energy. We work with a coalition of over 300 partners that we gather around specific communities of action to make change happen in these specific vertical areas that we feel like there is an inflection point. With just the right push, we can see a pretty radical change, not just in topics like jobs, but also in terms of acceptance of the benefits of faster access to energy through decentralized renewables. So there's a whole body of work you can learn more about on our website, powerforall.org. But I do think it's important, before we get into the discussion portion, to talk a little bit about integrated energy. So this has been an initiative that Power for All has been pushing really since our founding, to recognize the fact that neither centralized energy nor decentralized energy is actually purpose-built to do universal electrification, that we actually need to find a way to collaborate and work together. There's a different customer with a different energy need for pretty much every kind of energy company out there. And it's really the goal to find those matches. So when it comes to integrated energy, Power for All has been leading an initiative called Utilities 2.0, which most of those on this call have all been partners too. But this is a real effort to bring together centralized and decentralized forms of energy to work together and catalyze the research that's needed to find these pathways to partnership and identify both the engineering, regulation, and the political will needed to make integrated energy a critical pathway and a recognized approach within target countries. So next week, we'll be sharing some information about a commissioning event of this first pilot in Uganda, and we hope that you'll all be tuning into that. And again, many thanks to Gogla, AMDA, PowerGen specifically, Shortlist and CLASP for your incredible partnership as we proceed down this path and really begin to see a much more holistic sense of what the energy of the future looks like together. So with that, let me just get into some specifics, digging into the recommendations that were shared around. And Ashna, if you could put in the chat a link to the report, so anybody who'd like to sort of page through it as we're talking. I think that would be really great. So there's some priority results that are identified as a result of the technical working group on energy access. And one of these priority results is a reinforced enabling policy and regulatory framework that both attracts investment, but also makes it easier for companies to succeed. In particular, there's a call for the private sector to do a couple of actions. And I wanted to hear from Gogla and AMDA on this specifically, but obviously everybody's welcome to share their questions or points of view. So one of the things that was mentioned also in Koen's opening remarks was the importance of having well-functioning renewable energy associations in countries where there is an energy access deficit. And I know Gogla, AMDA, and ourselves have all done work in this area, so it'd be great to hear points of view on that. But quickly on the heels of that is actually what those associations need to be part of. And what's identified in the report is enacting policy and regulatory frameworks that empower and incentivize private sector investments and enable sustainable energy access expansion. So if I could maybe start, Koen, tossing it over to you and maybe hear about Gogla's direct experience. I know you like Power for All, have worked to help set up a number of renewable energy associations in target countries. It'd be great to hear about what you've seen as a criteria for those associations to be successful. And then also maybe we can hear from Aaron from his point of view on the Minigrid side. So Koen, maybe if you could lead us.
Yeah, there's a ton of things to be said around this. And we've produced some guidance that you can find on our website. We've produced a guide with policy recommendations for governments on what we think are the most important things that governments should keep in mind if they want to create a supportive enabling environment for the off-grid solar industry. We produced earlier this year a guide on what we think are effective ways of bringing subsidy into the space to make products more affordable for those that can't afford it. And also earlier this year, we produced a guide for national renewable energy associations. We did that together with Get Invest and Solar Power Europe, an industry association of European solar companies, on how to build strong national renewable energy associations. But just referring you to documents on our website is probably not the most interesting thing to do. So maybe a little bit on what we are asking governments to do is firstly embrace that off-grid solar technologies and private sector as business to consumer vehicles and channels can be a very important element of your energy, of a government's energy plan. That's not a given. If we look, for example, at India, India has reached massive success, but mostly with the government in the lead and private sector more as a supplier towards government of technology. But that's an approach that is going to be out of reach for many African governments because they just don't have the financial strength and depth to reach all those households and small businesses and farmers and larger businesses. So that's where the private sector can come in and be a vehicle for reaching those customers. Now, what we're asking governments is first embrace that in their planning. Secondly, to create predictive and stable policies, and then hopefully also supportive policies. VAT exemptions and import tariff exemptions are, in our view, fairly effective low-hanging fruit measures. But other regulation around the industry is also important, and the predictability and stability is just as important as how favorable they are for industry. Getting it right is often a matter of detail, and that's why we think the National Renewable Energy Associations are so important, because we think that it's important for governments to reach out to industry to nail the details of policies, because they can easily turn out counter-effective. To make that concrete, there were a couple of governments in Africa that introduced regulation around quality standards of products, trying to to push out low quality products that are making it onto the market in favor of certified products that were quality controlled. But then arranging the details of the policy so that actually you create extra boundaries for the high quality products, whereas the low quality products were still making it onto the markets through porous markets without any of those additional boundaries. So the effect was actually counterproductive, and the quality products were finding it more difficult to make it onto the market, and the low quality products just as easy. So trying to get those details right, I think, is really important. Then, as we are, as some markets are more advanced and are looking at how can we reach also those households and businesses that are not being reached right now, and for which products might be less affordable, we starting to look at subsidy schemes, often with the support of World Bank or other multilateral development banks. And then again, it's just as important as with the regulation that you get the details right, so that subsidies can also easily turn into a disturbing market force if you don't get it right. So we produced that guide, and we are shaping up a formal industry opinion as GOGLA members on what we see as favorable solutions to support the market. But that dialogue is so important to nail the details and make sure that we have a flexible arrangement that achieves the goals that the governments like to achieve and are not turning out counterproductive. And now I'm starting to repeat myself, so that's time to stop.
Well done. Thanks for that. And, you know, just one other thing I would say too, Koen, especially sort of in our early days of working together with GOGLA, being one of the founding partners of Power for All, just remembering back that there's a lot to be said for the industry working together to help the government understand how to regulate them. Because if we wait for regulation to come, we're probably going to be in a situation where it's a suboptimal situation. So that approach of being proactive is really, really critical. And on that, you know, Aaron, I'm just painfully aware that there is an incredible dearth of interconnection regulation for mini-grids, if that's ever a topic. And some countries are very far ahead when it comes to setting up standards for mini-grids, et cetera, and others are very far behind. So maybe you could speak a little bit to your experience, either as PowerGen or as a member of the board of AMDA, about what you see as critical for a really strong functioning renewable energy associations to help this sector grow.
Sure, happy to. It's not easy, that's for sure. I think having a clear policy recommendation and program recommendation is important to start. And I think there's a really good comment earlier by someone, sorry, I can't identify the individual, but someone made a good recommendation, which is that it needs to be country dependent. At the same time, I think having a standard program or policy recommendation to start off of as a foundation is helpful. I think that's what some of the reports and some of the work GOGLA and AMDA have done over the years, which is great. From there, I think it's going to involve a lot of deep government engagement and touch. The reality, I think, often not discussed in these forums is that a lot of this is face-to-face. It needs to be face-to-face, built with in-person relationships, sitting in minister and cabinet meetings for a long time, or even in the waiting room for a long time, which we do have experience with as both a developer and MDA. But that's just kind of the reality of, I think, how you most effectively work with government. Getting in-country staff who understand the dynamics of the government, the relationships is also, I think, very, very important. And as much as that can be driven by in-country staff, I think that's ideal. I recognize, it's not easy for industry associations just to do that overnight. It takes funding, it takes coordination, it takes organization, but I think those are really important steps forward. And then I think some of the things Koen mentioned are really important as well, which are having the right incentives for private developers. Given how hard commercially some of this work is, doing rural-based products or systems is often extremely high cost without high ability to spend from the consumer side. So I thought some of the VAT or income tax exemptions, we've been lucky enough to benefit from some of that in favorable government environments, and those meaningfully affect the economics of the project without hurting the customer experience. So it's really a win-win for multiple stakeholders. Yeah, those are some of the thoughts. Maybe Christina, to your specific point around interconnected regulation, it is hit or miss. I think you have some governments that are more open to private sector and some that are less open to private sector and want to do everything through the national grid or through the public utility for whichever reason that may be. And I think, to be frank, there's oftentimes not much you can do about that. If there's a government that isn't open to private sector or would rather do it on their own, then that's what it is. I think certainly bodies can make a case and advocate for more private sector involvement, but if data is shown and the benefits shown, but that's not really moving forward, then I have to say, from a private sector standpoint, we sort of have to move on to a different country. I do think the stability point is the last one that I'll emphasize, which is long-term stability is needed for us. It takes 2 to 4 years to really develop a project of sufficient scale when it comes to mini grids or larger DRE type solutions, like large CNI solutions. So yeah, stability is important, and I know that's not something any of us control. But having policy, bureaucratic, or I should say technocratic stability is really important. Otherwise, constantly changing policies every 5 years makes it very difficult for private sector to operate in.
Yeah, very well said. And, just to sort of reiterate what these two have said, early days trying to get a VAT linked, tariff exemption and tax exemption, in Sierra Leone, sure, that was a great accomplishment and it made a really big difference, but how did it get done? It meant going and waiting for the minister at 7 a.m. and getting seen at 4 p.m. And I know you understand what I'm talking about, Eric, but it's just the reality of the situation. But I think also having examples from countries that do have regulation and showing that correlation with growth of the sector and connection. So whether it's a Nigeria or Rwanda or something like that, reiterating those stories and being able to shine that light on what does work is an important thing we can all be doing. So just moving along to some other topics that came up in the report. Another result that was targeted was enhanced socioeconomic inclusiveness of energy access, which seems a little bit redundant, right? Because access itself, those who don't have it, we know largely where they're located, and we know about what those lives look like without the benefits of access to energy. But this is a question now for our friends at CLASP. In particular, the report identified increased access to appliances, in particular energy efficient cooling to enhance climate resilience, and to launch and enhance systematic efforts to stimulate productive use of electricity. So I'm wondering, James, if you could talk a little bit about what CLASP has seen as really a successful approach to better engage the private sector. What are some schemes that work in terms of financing or working with new energy consumers to really understand the opportunities that come with leasing to own appliances in some cases, or pay as you go? If you could, James, please.
Yeah, thank you. Talking about productive use, this is, it's an extremely important sector, and government has been conspicuous by its absence in supporting this sector so far. But that is I guess that is how it works, because this is a pretty new sector. There's a lot of innovation happening, and government probably doesn't really know what to do. And so it has been left to the private sector to drive this sector with support, of course, from funders and other people of goodwill. So first, to develop the sector, the productive use, and we are talking about cooling, as Christina, you mentioned. We are talking about solar water pumping for agriculture. We are talking about even other newer areas like grain milling, which are crucial to productivity and are pretty absent and expensive and climate polluting in the off-grid sector, because they are currently driven by diesel and other polluting fuels. So the first thing is to support the innovation process. A lot of these technologies are still developing, they're still evolving. CLASP, for instance, has supported best innovations in solar water pumps, in cooling, by giving awards, basically cash awards to people who are developing the best technologies, the best performing technologies. And this is a process that government can also come in and bring its resources to bear. And we are not always only talking about cash injection. Governments have access to research facilities, for instance. In the agriculture sector, governments have lots of land which is dedicated for agricultural research that can be availed to some of these innovators to experiment, rather than them going to people's farms, for example, to test how effective a solar water pump is. And if it proves ineffective, then it means crop failure for that farmer for that year. So government has the luxury of facilities that can be used for those purposes without badly affecting the poor people that we eventually hope that this equipment will benefit. And the second point is about standards. As the technology evolves, you want to weed out the non-performers or the poor performers. So this is where standards start to come in, and sometimes it scares people off when you start developing standards for technologies which are evolving. But a good approach, for example, is to start with a voluntary standard. You form a technical working group around a certain productive use appliance or piece of equipment. And through that technical working group, which governments can support, then you start to develop voluntary standards. And then later on, when the technology matures, you can move to compulsory standards. And that helps the private sector then to have a level playing field in terms of quality, in terms of performance. And performance here means both what it can deliver and how it can deliver, and also how much energy it can consume, which we are aiming, of course, to have the minimal energy consumption, so that these appliances and equipment can be useful in low power situations, mini-grid, off-grid, weak grid type of situations. And then finally is the question you raised about financing. There are innovative ways of financing to reach to the poor or to those who cannot afford, and to enable the private sector really to scale up and achieve economies of scale. The first support is usually from the donors who come in and come up with RBF schemes and other types of subsidy that then help the manufacturers, the suppliers and distributors to avail these products. Government also, can come in with incentives. I know we've mentioned tax incentives, the removal of tariffs, and that sort of thing. And that goes a long way. That can go a really long way in reducing the costs and in reducing the supply chain costs. in cooking, and I want to go back to this cooking because this utility financing model is something that may be applicable to other types of appliances, where mini grids and even main grids are in many cases actually struggling to fill up the demand. In Eastern Africa, for instance, in Kenya, in Uganda, and probably in Ethiopia and Tanzania, the grids are in this ironical situation where you still have many people who do not have access, but the grid itself is struggling because it is overcapacity. There was a lot of investment in generation infrastructure, but without requisite investment in the downstream infrastructure. And in many cases, it is unviable to have grid connections, which one is using only a few units. So that you end up with utilities, and in some cases, and Aaron is probably in a better position to talk about this from a mini grid perspective, but there are cases where even mini grids are struggling to increase demand. So them participating together with the private sector, because they know their customers, they know the people who are connected to them. They have their data, they have a billing system that is already operational, to bring in an appliance into that system, and then the appliance is financed through the utility or mini utility, and the payment comes back in a sort of in a software, either monthly through the monthly billing system. So you just include a little bit of the cost of the appliance. Then that will make it easier for the users to be able to pay for that appliance or a piece of equipment whose upfront cost is usually a little bit out of reach. But it will also increase the sales of power for the utility, and it will increase their revenue. So that kind of model can help in increasing finance. We are trying it. We are in the early stages of piloting it with a couple of utilities for electric pressure cooking, but we believe that it can go into other appliances that will use that power. I'll pause there.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that's great. Well, and interesting too about what you've said, historically, when other countries, including the US, have tried to achieve universal electrification, the use of white goods or appliances, often subsidized or sponsored by the utilities in some way, have been a really important growth mechanism for that demand, right? Because we do need that virtual cycle of enough demand to make our decentralized sources of energy successful, sustainable, profitable. And so it is a bit of a challenge, though, in the case of Uganda specifically. Currently, the main distribution utility, is prevented from doing something that we would call on-bill financing, right? Somewhat similar to, in a slightly different context of pay-as-you-go. But it is something that needs to be looked at when we're talking about regulation and holistic solutions to really encourage not just connections, but what we do with those connections. So your points, I think, are very well taken. And I think, between this topic and subsidy, I really feel like there's about to be a big shift in the kind of communication we're doing as a success sector about what's really critical for success. And, on that, you can't have that increase in demand or demand stimulation, as many of us refer to it as, without people to encourage those changes and to give people confidence as being new energy users that A, they can count on this energy because maybe they've had experiences where it's not been reliable in the past, but B, that they can take a chance and they can invest in creating a small business by buying a pressure cooker through some sort of financing, et cetera. But all that takes talented sales agents and people who are good communicators. And so, Simon, just one more question for you, and then we've got a couple questions that Ashna's been monitoring for us. You know, one of the outcomes that we're seeking in this technical working group report and this focus is really about human capital. And to some of your earlier points, you know, there has been a dearth of, I think, education and pipeline development. That certainly was part of our Powering Jobs report in 2019, that there's a whole broad scope of things we can do that begins with creating, you know, what I like to call the renewable energy generation or the regeneration, bringing people up from a very young age to think that renewables and distributed are business as usual, and that it's not always the centralized grid that's actually the best source of energy. But that all comes down to creating that pipeline, creating that awareness in target countries that this is a great place for careers to grow. And I'm just wondering, in some of maybe the training work you've been exposed to, either that some of especially the larger companies do within themselves, or in the case of like a Schneider Electric, who has a partnership with Don Bosco and is really focused on doing TVET training in countries around the world. What have you been seeing or observing as a really successful path to change, to create that interest in the sector and people seeing it as a place where they can start a career and grow with it for the next 20 to 30 years?
Sure, great question. I think several things, but one thing I would highlight is just the importance of partial cost offset to employers to stimulate them to actually hire more people than they otherwise would have. You find a lot of companies out there that have, say, budget to hire 20 people, but if they had a little bit of subsidy or a little bit of financial de-risking, they'd actually hire 50 or 100. And given that we're seeing such enormous conversion rates from part-time internships or graduate recruitment programs into full-time jobs, it's actually an incredibly low cost. It sounds counterintuitive in some quarters, because the pushback in some cases is, well, aren't you subsidizing the private sector? But in fact, if we're thinking about this from a cost per job created perspective, which I think many of us in the policy world are, a little bit of subsidy, often much less than $1,000 US, can actually create a brand new job that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and that company wouldn't necessarily, or an employer wouldn't have necessarily had the budget to bring on from day one. So I think there's an incredibly efficient use of time-bound, partial cost-sharing subsidy that governments could provide to enable enormous numbers of jobs to be created in this sector. So that's one area. And the other area is just how just generally awareness, not just amongst the candidate and job seeking community, but amongst the policy community and amongst the technical and vocational education community, that this is a great option. I think too often we're thinking about a very limited set of jobs, sometimes linked to agriculture or other subsectors, but actually just putting this sector on the map as an enormous employer, where there are tons of jobs that might start as an informal job, but that have clear pathways to becoming formal sector jobs, is exciting. And so I think what we're seeing is when we promote energy sector jobs and have, for example, from a gender lens perspective, female leaders promoted as role models, or entry-level talent promoted as examples, we tend to find a lot of young people starting to look at this sector as a possible pathway. And this doesn't have to be online. It can be through WhatsApp groups. It can be through SMS groups. It can be through offline campaigns as well. But I do think we need to raise the awareness of the sector from a recruitment and a careers perspective if we're going to meet the overall demands that we need to meet to hit SDG 7.
It's so well said. I mean, it would be the ultimate tragedy if the reason we don't achieve universal access is because of a dearth of human capital. And yeah, I know all of our organizations are concerned about this and working towards that as an end goal. So with just a few minutes left, Ashna, I wanted to see if you had any questions as sort of facilitator of the Q&A bit for the group.
Yes, of course. So the first question we have here is, what are the policy challenges for accelerating decentralized renewables? To talking really to the speed aspect of it, what is stopping us from achieving that?
And who should answer that question? Pick somebody.
It's open-ended, so whoever feels free. Yes, Koen.
Happy to respond to that. Yeah, how to we're thinking about it ourselves too. What are the game changers that can really switch gears in the industry? We've seen healthy growth in the last decade in the industry. We also see in the last few years actually that there's signs of stagnation as investment into the industry has actually not grown for a number of years. And so the question is how to get that growth back. For us, the number one is improved access to finance. We have been looking for a few years at commercial finance, attracting more commercial finance, but have concluded that this sector is not mature enough yet, and the risk profile is not transparent enough yet. Exits have not been sufficiently there to really make it attractive for commercial finance. So mostly investment in the space is coming from development finance institutions and impact investors. We think that a little bit more of that is needed, perhaps from climate finance, for more equity financing, more debt financing, cheaper debt financing also, and more seeds and early stage equity financing to get more innovation and new business models into the industry as the first measure to really scale up investment into the industry. And that could, I think, already lead to quick growth. And then we are also looking at measures such as result-based financing schemes that are pulling companies into new countries and new territories by offering them investment and grant funding based on the achievements that they realize. Some of that result-based financing can also be used to reduce the cost price for end users. We think that is necessary to reach the maybe a third or so of the population, the currently unserved population, for which the products are now still unaffordable. There's other models of end user subsidies and ways to reduce the affordability price, but that would also, of course, be an important measure to reach universal energy access. But in the balance of things, making capital available to companies is probably more important to reach growth than subsidies, although both are important. And then as a slower measure, but on the long term, the most important one, that's the regulatory environment. Make sure that the regulatory and enabling environment is welcoming to companies and make it stable, because that allows companies to invest, and that allows investors to invest into the industry. So there are no silver bullets to scale up, but an emphasis on finance.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Aaron. Aaron, you mentioned that it always helps to have in-country staff to kind of navigate the dynamics of the government within the geographical region. Would you have any other recommendations of how to forge these relationships with the government being in the private sector?
Sure. Maybe not the easiest question, because there is no one single answer to it. I think it's time, it's relationships face to face, and I think just understanding the people behind it as well. The people and their incentives. You know, obviously with government, their incentives and their I guess targets or KPIs in some sense are different than ours. So it's understanding those and then finding the overlap between what we bring. Those are typically the most important. Government's usually driven by policy from the top, and that's often driven by, I think, voter support, or if not voter support, I think public sentiment. So yeah, I think making sure that we can bring solutions that properly address those are important. I will say on the donor side, and maybe just to build off Koen's last point, donors, I think, bring sufficient amounts of financing will make it more interesting to governments. This is something when Christina was talking about waking up at 7 a.m., getting to the ministry office, and then not seeing the minister till 4 p.m. That reminded me a little bit of how much I think donors can change the landscape. So if and I think what Rockefeller, IKEA Foundation, they just made a press release this week, putting out $1 billion, $2 billion toward the sector is really meaningful. And if donors with the World Bank combined and DFID, or now FCDO, if those types of donors can group together and go to a single government and say, hey, we'll bring $500 million or $750 million and solve this problem for you in the next 3 to 5 years with these policy recommendations, it changes the game for the government so much. And that's when you get a meeting at, I think, 8 a.m., not 4 p.m. You bring a small program of 30 million pounds, and that's, I think, when we're waiting in offices for days, because the government's got so many other priorities to take care of. So I think that's something I think the sector should consider more about, is let's have the meaningful amount of scale to make this interesting for governments.
Yeah. Erin, let me just add a few points to that. And obviously we understand each other's pain quite well. So, but one thing I would say is that it really, at the end of the day, comes down to human beings and relationships. And no matter what else is true and what else is pulling people in different directions, it really is important to connect and have empathy with what civil servants and permanent secretaries are really trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Revolving door politics is going to be a case in every country. Sovereign risk is always going to be an issue. But at the end of the day, most country departments relevant to this sector, and that's not just the ministries of energy, but it's adjacent industries such as Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Education, Ministries of Labor. Those largely are staffed by career civil servants who really are committed people and just have enormous amounts on their plates. And so if we as a sector can be thinking about how do we help solve the problems that these overworked individuals have have to face on a daily basis, that's really can be a much more convincing way to get a door open than sort of storming in and accusing people of not having the right policies in place and whatnot. But I think starting almost at that human level and building those relationships can make a really, really big difference. And it takes persistence, bottom line, and real just continuity of attention. So we're at about 60 minutes. And with that, I did want to, Ashna, unless there's any other questions, just probably wrap up our discussion. Is there anything else, Ashna, to be asked?
No, I think this is a good time to wrap up.
Okay, perfect. Well, I want to thank so much friends and colleagues on this discussion today. I want to thank those of you who joined, and I also really want to congratulate SE for All, UN Energy, UN DESA, World Bank, and all of the other entities that worked so hard to make the high-level energy dialogues what they have become this year. I know that's something that the kind of attention and focus that so many of us have been hungry to see, and it's just been wonderful to be part of the process. So with that, we are going to be following up with all of the permanent missions to the UN with countries that are connected to topics related to energy access, energy poverty issues, want to increase demand for energy in their countries, et cetera, and continue to make this group available for any further advice or consultations as people are on the front lines working on these issues every day. And again, just a round of thank you for everyone for joining this discussion. It's been a pleasure as ever. And I really continue to appreciate personally the incredible show of commitment and dedication amongst this group of people to end energy poverty faster. Thank you.